The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, and people were already laughing. Not quietly, not politely. The kind of laughter that fills a room and bounces off the walls and makes the person it's aimed at feel about 2 inches tall. Silas Boone stood in the middle of Harlan County's largest agricultural auction. Worn boots, faded canvas jacket, a weathered leather folder tucked under his arm like it was nothing. And he didn't flinch. Not once. The Callaway farm was on the block. 412 acres of the richest bottomland in 3 counties. The kind of soil that practically grew money. Everyone wanted it. Developers had flown in from Atlanta and Denver. Investors had come up from Nashville. Grant Whitaker, the man who already owned half the county and never let anyone forget it, sat in the front row in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Silas's truck. And then Silas had raised his hand. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Carl Briggs who had been running sales for 30 years, stopped mid-sentence. "Did I just see?" Carl leaned forward, squinting. "Sir, are you placing a bid?" "I am," Silas said. "And your opening figure?" Silas said the number. Carl blinked. Then he laughed. He actually laughed into the microphone, which sent the entire room into chaos. A developer in the third row doubled over. Someone near the back let out a long, low whistle. Grant Whitaker turned around slowly, found Silas's face in the crowd, and smiled the way a man smiles when he's not worried at all. "Son," Grant said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you sure you're in the right building?" More laughter. Silas said nothing. He just stood there holding that folder, calm as still water, and waited for the room to quiet down. Nobody noticed that his knuckles, wrapped around that folder, had gone white. If you've ever been the person in the room that nobody believed in, stay right here. Because this story was made for you. Subscribe now. More stories like this every single week. The Callaway farm had been empty for 11 months. Old Walt Callaway had passed the previous winter, quietly, the way he'd lived, and left behind 400 acres, a modest farmhouse, and a family that had scattered to 4 different states and wanted nothing to do with tractor payments or harvest seasons. His daughter, Patricia, had driven down from Minneapolis, taken one look at the books, and called an auction house by the end of the week. Word spread fast. By the time the listing hit the regional papers, offers had already started coming in. The land sat along the Cumber River. Natural irrigation, rich loam soil, protected floodplain on the east edge. Agricultural consultants called it a once-in-a-generation buy, the kind of property that didn't come available twice. Silas Boone had known Walt Callaway for 31 years. They'd shared fence lines, shared equipment during bad seasons, shared coffee on cold mornings when neither of them felt much like talking. Walt had been the kind of man who believed a handshake meant something. The kind of man who, in 1987, had sat across a kitchen table from a 26-year-old Silas and said the words that Silas had never, not once, repeated to another living soul. Nobody knew what was in that folder. Not his wife, Martha, not his son, Daniel, not his neighbor Earl Pittman, who had farmed the land beside Silas for 20 years and considered himself close as family. "You're really going to that auction?" Earl had asked 2 days before, leaning against the fence between their properties, arms crossed, skeptical. "Thinking about it," Silas said. "Silas." Earl had looked at him carefully. "You know who's going, right? Whitaker's going. The development group from Atlanta's going. These aren't people playing around with a couple $100,000. They're talking millions." "I know." "Then you also know." I know, Earl. Earl had shaken his head slowly. I just don't want to watch you get humiliated in front of the whole county. Silas had smiled at that, a small, tired smile, and gone back to fixing the fence post he'd been working on. What Earl didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Silas Boone hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 weeks. The morning of the auction, Martha had found him at the kitchen table at 5 a.m., the folder open in front of him, reading the same pages he'd read 100 times already. Silas. She'd set a cup of coffee beside his hand. You don't have to do this. I know. If it goes wrong, it won't. You don't know that. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. We've spent 30 years building what we have. If something goes sideways today, we don't get that back. Silas had looked up at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't need words. 30 years of early mornings and late nights and seasons that nearly broke them and seasons that saved them and all the small, quiet moments in between. Walt trusted me with this, he said. I'm not going to let it die in a folder. Martha had been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd reached over, closed the folder gently, and slid it across the table toward him. Then go, she said, and don't you dare come home without it. Back in the auction hall, the laughter was dying down. Carl Briggs straightened his papers and cleared his throat. The rules were the rules. Any registered bidder could open at any price, and Silas Boone had registered 3 weeks ago with a certified check. Carl had the documentation right in front of him. Grant Whitaker had stopped smiling. Not because he was worried. He wasn't. Not yet. He just didn't like loose threads, and Silas Boone, standing there like he belonged, felt, somehow, like a loose thread. He leaned over to the man beside him, his attorney, a sharp-faced man named Donovan Reed, and murmured something. Donovan glanced back at Silas, studied him for a moment, and then leaned in to respond. Whatever he said made Grant's jaw tighten. The bidding opened. Numbers climbed fast. The developer from Atlanta jumped in hard. A woman representing a land investment group out of Calgary came in with a number that made Carl's eyebrows rise. Grant Whitaker raised his paddle with the kind of casual certainty that said he'd already budgeted for this, already planned for this, already decided this was his. And every few rounds, Silas quietly raised his hand. His numbers were modest, almost insultingly so. Each time they drew fresh murmurs from the crowd. Each time Grant's attorney jotted something down. Each time Silas stood perfectly still, folder under his arm, face giving nothing away. "What is he doing?" a young man near the back whispered to the woman beside him. She shook her head. "No idea. He can't actually think he's going to. He just bid again. Does he know what this land is worth? He's a farmer. He's been farming next to this property for years. Of course he knows." The young man frowned. Then why is he bidding like that? Nobody had an answer. 40 minutes in, the room had narrowed to 3 serious contenders: Grant Whitaker, the Calgary Investment Group, and, impossibly, stubbornly, Silas Boone. Grant turned around again. This time he didn't smile. "Friend," he said, the word sharp at the edges, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're wasting everyone's time. This property is going to sell for 3 or 4 times what you can afford. You should step out while you've still got your dignity." The room went quiet. Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I appreciate the concern." That was all. Grant stared at him, then turned back around. Donovan leaned in again. Sir, I did some checking. His registered bid documentation. He's got a co-signatory on it. Local name. Retired man, lives about 10 miles out. Who? Man named Thomas Elgin. Grant paused. The Thomas Elgin? The one who used to run the... Yes, sir. A long silence. Look into it. Tom Elgin was 74 years old, drove a rusted pickup older than most people in the room, and had spent 40 years as the most respected agricultural lender in the county before retiring. He was also sitting quietly in the back row, hat in his lap, watching the auction with calm, unreadable eyes. He and Silas hadn't spoken since Tom had walked into the local bank 6 weeks ago, not as a customer, but as a man calling in a favor from an old colleague, and quietly co-signed the most unusual financing arrangement Tom had ever put his name on. "You understand," Tom had said, sitting across from Silas in the bank's small conference room, "that if this doesn't work exactly the way you think it does, you lose the farm." "I know. Your actual farm, the one your father built." "Tom," Silas had met his eyes, "I've read that document every single year for 30 years. I know what it says." Tom had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd picked up the pen. "Walt always said you were the most patient man he'd ever met," Tom said. "I used to think that was a compliment." "It is. Today," Tom said, signing his name, "we find out." Back in the auction hall, the Calgary group dropped out. Just like that. A brief phone call, a whispered conversation, and the woman lowered her paddle and began gathering her things. The room shifted. Now it was two, Grant Whitaker and Silas Boone, and there was not a single person in that room, including Carl Briggs, who believed this was going to end any way other than one. Grant raised his paddle, a number that drew a collective inhale from the crowd. Carl looked at Silas. "Sir, do you wish to continue?" Silas reached into the folder. The room changed. It was subtle. A collective stillness, the way a room gets when something unexpected happens and nobody knows what to do yet. Grant's attorney sat up straighter. Carl Briggs frowned. A woman near the middle section craned her neck. Silas pulled out a single document, aged paper, the edges soft with time, and walked it to the front of the room. He handed it to Carl without a word. Carl looked at it. His expression shifted once, then again, then settled into something unreadable. He turned to his right and handed it to the woman beside him, the auction's legal liaison, a no-nonsense attorney named Sandra Chu, who had been monitoring proceedings for the house. Sandra read it. She read it again. Then she looked up at Silas with an expression that was not quite surprising and not quite understanding, but something caught between the two. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "where did you get this?" "Walt Calloway's kitchen table," Silas said. 1987. The room erupted, not with laughter this time, with questions, with voices climbing over each other, with Grant Whitaker standing up so fast his chair scraped back, demanding to know what the document said, demanding his attorney get to the front of the room, demanding that Carl Briggs explain what was happening right now. What the document said, what it had always said for 38 years, folded carefully in that weathered leather folder, was this: "In the event of the sale or auction of the Calloway farm, the adjacent landholder to the west shall retain first right of purchase at any price matched within the preceding auction." Walt Calloway had written it himself, witnessed by 2 signatures, notarized in September of 1987, and filed in the County Land Records Office where it had sat, unremarkably, for nearly 4 decades. He had written it because in 1987, A development company had tried to buy a strip of his land that would have landlocked Silas's property, and Walt had looked at the young farmer beside him and said, "I'll never let that happen to you. You have my word, and I'll put it in writing." He had meant it as protection, a legal guarantee between neighbors. He had never imagined his own farm would one day go to auction. Neither had Silas until 11 months ago, when Walt had passed, and Silas had gone home that night and opened the folder for the first time in years, and sat at his kitchen table and read those words again and understood, with a certainty that kept him awake for weeks, exactly what they meant. Grant Whitaker understood too now. His face had gone a color that didn't have a good name. "That can't be enforceable," he said, his voice controlled but thin at the edges. "That's a personal agreement between two private parties. It has no bearing on a public auction." Sandra Chu looked at him. "Mr. Whitaker, this document was filed with the county in 1987. It is attached to the deed. It is, in fact, entirely enforceable. I want my attorneys to review—" "You're welcome to." Her voice did not change. "The auction will pause while we verify, but I will tell you now. I've been doing this for 18 years, and what I'm looking at is a valid right of first refusal. That means if Mr. Boone matches the highest bid at close, this property is his." Silence. Real silence. The kind that presses on your ears. Grant looked at Silas. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes. Something that wasn't confidence. "Match it," he said, his voice dropping low. "You can't match it. You don't have the money." And there it was. The question that had been sitting in the center of the room the entire time, patient as Silas himself, waiting to be asked. Could he match it? Tom Elgin stood up from the back row. He walked slowly to the front of the room, no rush, no drama, and set a single envelope on the table beside Sandra Chu. She opened it. Read it. And for the second time in 10 minutes, her expression shifted. Inside the envelope was a letter of financing, not from a major bank, not from an investment fund, but from a collective. 11 neighboring farm families, all of whom had farmed within 20 miles of Callaway land, all of whom had signed. People who had watched Silas Boone work for 30 years. People who had borrowed his equipment and shared his fences and trusted his word. People who, when Tom Elgin had made a quiet phone call 6 weeks ago, had said yes before he finished the sentence. Martha had known. She'd helped make 4 of those calls herself. Earl Pittman, who had told Silas he'd get humiliated, had been the first to sign. Grant stared at the letter. His attorney was talking in his ear. His phone was out. Numbers were being recalculated. Options were being weighed. And across the room, an older woman, Walt Callaway's daughter Patricia, who had flown in from Minneapolis and sat quietly in the corner all morning, stood up from her seat and pressed both hands over her mouth. Because she was looking at Silas Boone holding that folder, surrounded by the community her father had loved, and she understood something that the developers and the investors and the men in expensive suits had never understood at all. Her father hadn't just owned that land. He had belonged to it, and he had made sure, 38 years ago, that the man who belonged beside it would always have a chance to keep it whole. The gavel fell at 2:17 in the afternoon. Carl Briggs said the words slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted them to land properly. Silas Boone, Callaway Farm, sold. Nobody laughed. Grant Whitaker walked out without a word, his attorney at his elbow, already on the phone. Some people in the room began to clap. Quietly at first, then steadier, then filling the room with something that felt less like celebration and more like relief. Patricia Calloway crossed the room and stopped in front of Silas. She was crying. She didn't apologize for it. "He talked about you," she said. "Every time I called home, he always mentioned the Boone boy next door." "He was a good man," Silas said. His voice was rough. "He trusted you with that document for 38 years. She shook her head slowly. "Most people would have forgotten about it, or lost it, or decided it wasn't worth the trouble." Silas looked down at the folder in his hands, worn at the corners, soft from handling, kept safe through drought years and good years and all the years in between. "It wasn't mine to forget," he said. "That was 6 years ago. The Calloway farm and the Boone farm run together now. 600 acres, the fence line between them long since gone. Daniel Boone, Silas's son, manages the eastern fields. His daughter, a 22-year-old named Claire, who grew up riding on her grandfather's tractor, is studying agricultural science and will take over both one day. Earl Pittman still farms next door. He still leans on the fence sometimes and watches the Boone land stretch out to the river, and sometimes he shakes his head the way he did the day before the auction. But it's a different kind of headshake now. Silas still wakes up early. He still fixes fence posts himself, even when Daniel tells him he doesn't have to. He still keeps a leather folder on the shelf above his kitchen table. Empty now, the document filed safe with his deed, because some objects carry more than their contents. There's a photograph in the farmhouse hallway. Walt Calloway and Silas, sometime in the late 80s, standing at the fence line between their properties. Two men squinting into the sun, arms crossed, both looking out at the same land. Underneath it, in Martha's handwriting, 4 words. He prepared for this. The auction hall in Harlan County was full of people who saw one morning. One bid, one farmer in worn boots who didn't belong. Silas Boone had spent 38 years preparing for that morning. And that is the whole story, really. Not the document, not the financing, not the legal right that stopped the auction cold. The story is this. While everyone else was watching the moment, Silas was building toward it. Quietly, patiently, without applause, without anyone watching, without any guarantee that the moment would ever even come. The loudest people in that room had money and lawyers and confidence and connections. Silas had something they'd never thought to acquire. He had 38 years of showing up. And on the one morning it mattered most, that was worth more than everything else in the room combined.